Ashanti Alston, a former Black Panther turned anarchist, writes in an essay titled Beyond Nationalism, but Not Without It. The piece was a response to the white anarchist absolutist position, generalizing all nationalism of all people without considering what it means for people of color or other oppressed nationalities. Ashanti underlines how Black nationalism was essential for his political growth, and without it, he never would have become an activist, Black Panther, and later an anarchist. Black nationalism has been a part of our diaspora's politics for as long as we have been fighting for liberation. Since the time when Martin R. Delany, a contemporary and ideological opponent of Frederick Douglass, had both parted ways as slave absolutionists over the ongoing debate among Black people. Where are we to go and what are we to do? This was around 1850. Frederick Douglass took the position of assimilating into American society as Black Americans, thinking we should work hard to prove that we can fit in. Delany wanted us to flee as a group into the countryside of South America, claim unclaimed land, and form a colony nation. I will most likely go into more detail about Martin Delany's work in a later episode of this series, but I wanted to establish when Black nationalism took root and who laid the foundation of the ideology. Needless to say, Black nationalism never really died since the death of Delany in 1885. Since then, Black leaders and movements of note, ranging from Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, Moorish Science Temple of America, the Nation of Islam, with smaller nationalist movements before, after, and in between, continued pushing Black nationalism's ideas of socio-political independence, self-determinism, and pride. Again, in later videos of this series, I will talk a little about these organizations, but my main point is that Black nationalism is essential to gaining political awareness and should not be forgotten or dismissed. Having said that, it is important to question whether one should only embrace Black nationalism, considering that it never really evolved after the height of its popularity in the mid to late 1960s. Now, back then, Black nationalism was at least diverse in that one had choices between the theist organizations like the Nation of Islam, or you had the cultural nationalism such as Maulana Karenga's U.S. organization, also known as United Slaves, offering an Afrocentric culture for Black people to embrace. And finally, you had the left revolutionary Black nationalism of the Black Panther Party, less theist or cultural of the former two nationalist tendencies mentioned. The Panthers basically took up the mantle of where Malcolm was trying to take Black nationalism after he left the Nation of Islam. He had a stronger anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist stance. I'll be talking about that in a future episode of this series as well. Also, I cannot leave out the Black Power movement, which was pushed more by Black militant college students at the time as well. All of these movements or tendencies were the binding force in heightening the collective political consciousness at the time in the 1960s for the Black community. So what the fuck happened? How did we go from a Black nationalism as it was once envisioned from the 1800s to the most progressive form as put forth by the Panthers to wind up with these random micro-cults and online dogmatic keyboard ayatollahs? Of course, they're religious-based groups structured from top to bottom with patriarchal leaders. You've got their hatred for Black women and Black LGBT people, and there's their lazy preference for authoritarianism as an organizational tool that actually works against Black people, and it ironically places them right next to white supremacists with fascist tendencies. I'll be getting into them in a future video as well. The short answer is a vacuum, where a mass Black movement should have been in the past 3 decades, and the result is due to a serious intellectual and organizational regression. The long answer is that violent campaigns were launched by our government, targeting all of the mentioned movements through the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO. We saw the Panthers go down quickly and their legacy all but erased. It's always been my belief that out of all of these movements in the past, it was the Panthers who were the real threat, more than an aging Nation of Islam, who at the time was losing its appeal to the youth to one of its bastard street-connected movements, the Five Percenters. The Panthers were a far bigger threat than Malena's group, who were far too content playing with wooden statues and dressing up like kings of never were. In fact, we all know that it was Malena Karenga who went on a decade later to give us Kwanzaa, so there was no threat to American capitalism from his United Slaves. If anything, the racist ruling class and the government who serves them might be very happy with the current scene we know today as the pro-blacks. Lacking in intellectualism and organization, as I've said before, rife with disunity, and quite frankly, holding some ideas that are just as racist against black people as the ideas of the average white supremacist. For example, like this one pro-black sect that claims that black people in America are really indigenous to the Northern American continent rather than Africa, which none of these child fuckers can claim is true with DNA data or actual documented facts. Yet, all DNA and historical documentation points to Africa in terms of where we are from. Even the whole human race started from there. What these reactionaries are really doing is actually what white supremacy has always wanted out of black people: reject anything remotely black, and with that nonsense, this particular sect claims to be pro-black and yet not a threat at all to white supremacy, capitalism, the government, and the class system that directly oppresses us as a group. So when we talk about the pro-blacks, both in real life as well as in social media, know where they came from, but understand why they are the shit show they are now. From my point of view as a student of history of black struggle and sociology, they are little more than chocolate-dipped rednecks who could not lead themselves or each other across the street. In the meantime, if you are young, old, or in between, and you have gained knowledge of self for the first time, embrace black nationalism and study it for what it was, but look beyond it to seek answers for our people. This is the Garage Autonomist.